Well, I mentioned in another video that I'm taking a trip down south and then out west a little bit. And one of the things that I wanted to do in my travels is show some video of where I grew up. And behind me here is the church that I grew up going to. My dad actually planted this church in 1975, and they got this property that I'm standing on here around 1980. It was a really amazing story how God supplied this property. It was essentially given to the church. But that's the building that they used for many years, and that's where I grew up going to church. So the property that the church is on is 10 acres of land. It originally was a swim club, and I think that was probably back in the 1950s and 60s. And they had a Little League field here, a ball field, and it's still a softball field. The church used that for a long time. And then at the end of the property there is where my parents still live. And that's actually the house that I grew up in for most of my childhood, was in that house at the end of the property there. But there used to be swimming pools on this property. I think when we acquired the property as a church, they filled in the pools, which I think were over there in that area. And here's a really big oak tree that's on the property. And one story about this tree is that I remember I was in the house back there in the background. That's where we lived, and I remember as a kid, I was lying down in my house, and all of a sudden during a storm, I heard this huge bang, and it was lightning that had struck this tree here. And I think it took a direct hit, and you used to be able to see where the lightning hit on this tree, but it has survived and managed to thrive in spite of being struck by lightning years ago. It's a fall day, by the way, so a lot of wind right now. The leaves on this tree are just starting to change a little bit. But that's the tree that survived a lightning strike. So I thought it would be neat to take a shot of where I actually first lived. This is actually the neighborhood that I lived on when I was born and brought home. And right behind me there is a white house, and that's actually the first house that I ever lived in. This, I think, is still Hamilton, New Jersey, where I am right now, but it's right near Trenton, New Jersey. I'm also going to show a clip of the house that I grew up in that was actually in downtown Trenton, and that's a much more urban kind of city area. But as you can see, the neighborhood here around this house, kind of suburban, really nice neighborhood. And I don't really remember much about living around here. I have kind of a vague memory of walking along the sidewalks here somewhere with my mom when I was really, really little. But I really don't remember much else. Just a few hazy memories of being inside the house a little bit, but not much. And I actually lived there until I was about 3 years old, and so that's why I don't really remember much about it. But it's really cool to come back here and just see what the neighborhood looks like. It's actually really quite a nice area. So that's it. This is where I was, this is where I first lived. Well, I'm in another cool spot now. This is actually in Trenton, and around me it's a pretty busy area. You can see a lot of traffic, cars. But right here is a building that I wanted to show you. This is actually the building that the church my dad planted in 1975. This building is the one that they, I think this was the first place they rented and met at. I don't think there was one before this. And it was actually at the time a Seventh-day Adventist church. So the church that my dad planted, New Testament Baptist, was able to meet here on Sundays because the Seventh-day Adventists weren't using it on Sundays. So it worked out, and this is the building. And around this building here, it's actually called now Light of the World Light of the World Family Worship. But around this building here, you can see is just a lot of busy traffic. It's right getting into a pretty city area here. But I do have memories of being in this building when I was really little. I think this was probably up until like 1985 that they met here, which would have been like the first 5 years or so of my life that we met in this building. So this is where I first went to church, first learned about God, first started to learn about the Bible, was right here at this building. And as I said, it's kind of getting down into downtown Trenton, and all around here you can see a lot of traffic. Pretty busy. It's nice to see though that it's still a church, and they actually have on the side, I think you may have seen it before, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden." So that's great. Verse from Matthew 14, quoting Jesus. So that's the first place, the first building that I ever went to church in. Well, this is pretty cool. I'm actually across the street from the house that I grew up in. And this was where I lived from the time that I was 3 to the time that I was 7. And this is in downtown Trenton. It's definitely a very city-ish area down here. And right now, across the street, there's an AutoZone. But when I was little, there was actually a Roy Rogers here. It was a restaurant. And in back of the house there, we had a shed. And one night, my mom woke me up in the middle of the night and told me that we had to get out of bed quickly, get out of the house. And we came over to this parking lot where the AutoZone is now. And we stood here, and what happened is someone had actually set fire to our shed behind the house there. So we stood across the street here in the middle of the night while the fire department came and put out the fire. And it was really actually due to a person who was banging on our door and woke up my parents that we even knew there was a fire, and the flames in the shed were actually starting to come toward the house, and there were actually marks on the brick on the house there where the fire was starting to burn the house. So thanks to someone who saw that fire and took the opportunity to actually bang on our door, they really probably saved our lives. I think just thinking about that story makes me think of how, you know, God calls us to reach out to people, to rescue people, and that when you reach out to someone with the gospel and you care enough about them to talk to them, get to know them, and share God's love and truth with them, you're actually kind of doing what that person did that night for us in a spiritual sense. You're really saving people from the danger that they're in. And so I'm really grateful. I'll always remember that. It's a very interesting area, kind of a sketchy area. It's not too bad, but it's certainly not the nicest area. There's a photography place right down there, and I'm not sure what that used to be. At the end of the street there, or the end of the block there, there's, I think, still a store there. And on the other side, I think, was a liquor store, or a bar, which I think might also still be there. So in some ways a lot has changed, but in some ways it hasn't really changed much. So one of the reasons I'm showing this property where I grew up, partly to share it with all of you who watch my channel and just want to know a little bit more about my background and where I grew up. This is in Hamilton, New Jersey, right outside of Trenton, New Jersey. So one reason I wanted to show it is just to show all of you this, but another reason I wanted to show this is because the church now actually meets in a different location. My brother Ron is now the lead pastor of the church that my dad planted years ago. It does have a different name now, and they meet at a different location, and so they're actually going to be selling this property, and I believe that they're going to be building a lot of houses where I'm standing right now. But it got me thinking as I'm looking at the place here that I grew up on and seeing how it's not going to be the same as it was before. It really got me thinking about something in the book of Ecclesiastes, how it talks about that there's a time for certain seasons, a time for certain things to take place. A lot of you know that portion of the book of Ecclesiastes. It's often quoted. But it got me thinking about how, this is a season of my life. This is where I grew up. And I have to say goodbye to this. This is no longer going to be the property that I go back to when I visit my parents. And that's okay, because that's a season of life that is now in the past, and time is moving on. It got me thinking, though, about the book of Ecclesiastes and how it talks about different seasons. And I know right now there are a lot of people going through difficult things, and we're in a season right now in our culture of a lot of upheaval, a lot of disorientation, a lot of angst. And it can cause us sometimes, even as Christians, to think that we're in these really hard times, and why does it have to be like this? And we've really had a lot of loss is how we feel. But when I think about what the scripture's saying there, it even talks about a season for things that we might look at as pretty bad things. There are seasons, it talks about, of war, and seasons where we cannot embrace. There are seasons where things are not the way that we want them to be. But what we have to remember is that they are seasons. And just like the seasons of earth, right now it's the fall and you can see the leaves are changing. It doesn't last forever, and it brings in a new season. And the point I really was thinking about with all this is that there is a purpose for every season. It doesn't last forever, but God has a purpose for it, even when we don't understand what the purpose is right now. I think about what happened with the Israelites in their worst season, where they were in exile, they were judged by God, they had been taken over by another country, a superpower, and sent away from their homeland. But God said to them that He hadn't forgotten them, that He loved them with an everlasting love, and He knows the plans that He has for them. He had plans for their future. It was plans for peace. It was plans for their prosperity and their thriving. God did not forget His people. So the season that they were going through, that season of exile, was really hard, but it was bringing about a good purpose. And so as I'm saying goodbye to a season of my life where I grew up, I have to realize, this is just part of life. There are changes, and we're in a season of transition now. We see that in our culture, but we have to remember that it's not going to last forever. There's a purpose in it, and God has a plan that He is bringing about. Another thing is that when we think about the time that we're in right now, I'm reminded of what happened in the book of Esther, that she was put there, it was said, for such a time as this. And whatever it is that we're going through, whatever it is that God has placed us in, it is for a reason. We are put here in this time and place for such a time as this. So we should look forward to the future with hope, but we also have to remember that what we're going through right now, God has put us in purposely for a reason, and we want to be hopeful and thankful and faithful to God in the time that He has placed us. So I hope some of what I've said there has been encouraging to you. It is hard. It is hard for me to look at this place and know that I have to say goodbye. It's hard to see that my dad, who, when I was younger, he was in the center of ministry, the prime of his life, and now he's really moved into retirement more and more. But as I said, my brother Ron is pastoring the church that my dad planted. So yeah, it's a time of change. In a sense, it's even a time of sorrow and letting go, but it's a season. So whatever season you're in, I know it might be hard for you, but remember, it's a season, it's temporary, and also it's bringing about a future. It's bringing about a purpose that God has in store. So thanks for taking a little look at my childhood with me and listening to some of my thoughts here from A Frisch Perspective.